Man saves a dying old male lion. You won't believe what happens next. The shallow, labored breathing was the first sign that something was desperately wrong beneath the ancient acacia tree. Each rise and fall of the massive ribcage, so faint that wildlife conservationist Michael Harrison had to strain his eyes to confirm what he was seeing. The old male lion lay stretched on his side in the dappled shade. His once golden coat, now dulled to the color of weathered leather, matted with dust, and the evidence of days spent motionless on the hard earth. Even from 30 meters away, Michael could see that this was not the temporary rest of a healthy predator, but the profound stillness of a creature whose body was surrendering to forces beyond his control. Michael approached with the careful steps of someone who had spent 15 years learning to read the subtle language of African wildlife. His trained eyes, cataloging details that painted an increasingly somber picture. The lion's great head lay flat against the ground, his magnificent mane reduced to sparse gray-streaked tufts that spoke of advanced age and declining health. His amber eyes, though still open, had lost the fierce intensity that should have marked him as apex predator, replaced instead by a distant weariness that suggested he was looking at worlds beyond the immediate landscape. The conservationist's heart sank as he recognized the telltale signs of a lion in his final decline. The great cat's breathing was not just labored but irregular, sometimes pausing for long seconds before resuming with visible effort. His powerful limbs, which had once carried him across vast territories and brought down prey animals twice his size, now lay splayed awkwardly beneath him, lacking the strength to maintain even basic posture. Most telling was the way flies had begun to gather around his eyes and muzzle, insects that healthy lions would normally dispel with an irritated flick of ear or tail. This was clearly a patriarch, perhaps 20 years old or more, bearing the scars and worn features that marked him as a veteran of countless territorial battles and successful hunts. His massive skull and the breadth of his shoulders suggested he had once been a dominant male, the kind of lion whose roar could carry for miles, and whose presence alone could determine the movement patterns of entire herds. Yet now he lay forgotten beneath this solitary tree, abandoned by whatever pride he had once protected and ruled. Michael knelt at a respectful distance, understanding that even a dying lion retained the potential for one final, dangerous surge of strength if he felt threatened. The great cat's ears swiveled slightly at the sound of human approach, but his head remained pressed to the earth, as if lifting it would require more energy than his failing body could provide. There was something profoundly tragic about witnessing the end of such a magnificent creature, a living embodiment of wilderness majesty, reduced to shallow breaths and the patient approach of death. "Easy there, old king," Michael whispered, his voice carrying the reverence due to a creature whose very existence had shaped the ecosystem for decades. The afternoon sun filtered through the acacia's thorny branches, casting shifting patterns of light across the lion's motionless form as time itself seemed to slow in recognition of a monarch's final hours. Michael's decision to remain with the dying lion through the approaching night came not from any expectation of success, but from the deeper understanding that no creature should face its final hours alone. He retrieved his emergency supplies from the Land Rover collapsible water bowl, basic veterinary kit, and a thermal blanket that might provide some comfort against the cooling air. The great cat's breathing remained shallow and irregular. As Michael settled into position several meters away, close enough to help, but far enough to avoid causing additional stress to an animal whose energy reserves were already critically depleted. The first act of care was the simplest but perhaps most crucial. Michael poured clean water into the bowl and placed it within reach of the lion's muzzle. understanding that dehydration was likely accelerating the great cat's decline. For nearly an hour, the water sat untouched, but eventually the lion's pink tongue emerged to take tentative laps, each small amount absorbed immediately by tissues that had been starved of moisture. The sight of that tongue moving, however weakly, represented the first sign that the ancient predator's body was still fighting for survival. As darkness settled over the savannah, Michael established a gentle routine of care that respected the boundaries between their species, while offering what comfort he could provide. He used a damp cloth to clean around the lion's eyes and nostrils, removing the accumulated dust and debris that had gathered during his long vigil beneath the acacia. The great cat's amber eyes tracked these movements with growing awareness, no longer holding the distant gaze of an animal, preparing for death, but showing signs of engagement with his immediate surroundings. Throughout the long hours of the night, Michael maintained his quiet presence, occasionally offering water and adjusting the thermal blanket he had draped over the lion's hindquarters to help maintain body temperature as the desert air grew cold. The most remarkable change came gradually, so slowly that it might have been missed by a less patient observer. The lion's breathing began to deepen and regularize, each inhalation bringing more oxygen to organs that were slowly responding to hydration and the reduced stress of having a guardian nearby. By the early hours before dawn, the great cat had managed to lift his massive head from the ground for the first time since Michael's arrival. The movement requiring obvious effort, but representing a significant improvement from the near-catatonic state of the previous evening. His ears had begun to swivel toward distant sounds, the night calls of hyenas, the rustle of wind through dry grass, indicating that his awareness was expanding beyond the immediate struggle for survival. The most profound moment came as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the acacia's branches. The lion's amber eyes found Michael's face and held his gaze with an intensity that seemed to bridge the evolutionary distance between predator and human. There was recognition in that look, not the simple awareness of prey recognizing predator, but something deeper that spoke to the ancient covenant between all living things facing mortality together. "You're stronger than you know," Michael whispered into the growing light, his voice carrying years of respect for the wild creatures who had taught him about resilience. The lion's response was to shift his weight, drawing his powerful front legs beneath his chest in preparation for what would be his first attempt to rise since collapsing beneath the tree. The lion's rise from the earth came in stages, each movement a testament to will overcoming the limitations of age and exhaustion. Michael watched as the great cat gathered his legs beneath him, muscles trembling with effort as he pushed his massive frame upright for the first time in what might have been days. But instead of collapsing back to the ground or seeking more water, the old king did something that stopped Michael's breath entirely. He began walking with slow, deliberate steps toward a cluster of sandstone rocks 50 meters away, pausing every few strides to look back with unmistakable intention. The invitation was so clear, it transcended species. A request for Michael to follow that carried the weight of something profound waiting to be revealed. The lion's gait was unsteady but purposeful, each paw placed with the care of an animal conserving every ounce of remaining strength for a journey that clearly held deep significance. His great head turned repeatedly to ensure Michael was following, amber eyes holding a gravity that spoke of secrets carried through the long night of his vigil. As they approached the rocky outcrop, Michael began to understand the truth that had sustained this magnificent creature through what should have been his final hours. Lying in the shadow of the largest boulder, partially hidden by tufts of dried grass, was the still form of a lioness, whose golden coat had faded to the same weathered hue as her mate's. She had been dead for days, perhaps longer, but her body remained undisturbed by scavengers, protected by the constant presence of the male who had refused to abandon her even as his own life ebbed away. The old lion settled beside his mate with visible relief, his massive frame finally allowing itself to rest against the stone that had sheltered them both during their final chapter together. His muzzle gently touched her still flank, in a gesture so tender it spoke to bonds forged across decades of shared territory, successful hunts, and cubs raised together under the endless African sky. This had been his vigil, his final act of devotion to a partnership that had defined both their lives. Michael stood at a respectful distance, understanding that he was witnessing something sacred in the language of the wilder love story, written in loyalty and loss, played out beneath stars that had watched over countless such endings throughout the long history of life on Earth. The morning light painted the rocks golden, as a gentle wind stirred the grass around the reunited pair. "Rest now, old king," Michael whispered, his voice carrying across the dawn-touched landscape. The ancient lion's eyes closed as the sun climbed higher, finally allowing himself the peace that comes only when duty has been fulfilled and love has been honored to the very end.